Dorothy Ogden has never learned to say no. Not to the exhausted senior maid who shoved a mop and a ring of forbidden keys into her hands and hissed, "East Wing, third corridor, do it before the king returns." Not to the wicked little voice inside her own chest that whispered, "Just one room, no one will know." And definitely not to her own treacherous nose, that gift, that curse that had been pulling her towards something warm and dark and devastating ever since she stepped through the armory's iron door. She told herself she was only collecting the cloak for laundering. She told herself she would fold it, set it aside, and leave. She told herself a great many things. But the moment the heavy black fur settled across her hands, dense and wild and carrying a scent so layered it felt like falling through an entire forest at midnight, Dorothy stopped telling herself anything at all. She knelt. That was the first mistake. She pressed her face into the fur, just slightly, just to understand it, because that is what her nose does. That is what it has always done. It does not simply smell things, it reads them. And the cloak of Alpha King Russell Curry read like a storm system, like iron and pine resin and something older than the palace itself, like power that had never once apologized for existing. Her eyes closed. The small mole at the corner of her mouth pressed into black fur. A breath moved through her, slow, deep, catastrophically complete. She had no idea in that moment that an alpha's cloak is not merely clothing. She had no idea that it is a tether, that it holds the wolf side leashed between full moons, that every sacred fiber of it is soaked in a king's identity, and that inhaling it, claiming it with your own breath, is the one thing in all the kingdom that is punishable not just by the dungeon, but by death. She also had no idea that the corridor outside had gone completely silent. The guards had stopped moving, and the heavy oak doors at the far end of the armory were beginning to splinter. Dorothy's eyes were still closed when the iron hinges screamed, still closed when the cold night air crashed into the room like a living thing, still closed, God help her, still closed, when a shadow fell across the candlelight and swallowed the entire room whole. The voice, when it came, was not loud. That was the worst part. She had expected shouting. She had expected a king's bellow, the kind that rattles the stone walls and sends lesser people running. What she got was quieter than that. Quieter and so much more dangerous. Who? Just one word, barely above a growl, and Dorothy's eyes flew open. He filled the doorway the way a mountain fills a horizon, not standing in it so much as occupying it, as if the architecture had been built specifically to frame him. His dark leather armor was road-worn and battle-scarred, fur-lined at the shoulders, wide enough that the broken door panels dangled on either side of him like splinters of something he had simply decided to remove. His hair was long and dark and wild. His jaw was carved from something harder than patience, and his eyes were gold. Not amber, not hazel, gold, burning and wolfish and locked with terrifying precision directly onto her. Dorothy's face was still buried in his cloak. She had not yet moved. She was not entirely sure she could. Alpha King Russell Curry stared at the kneeling maid in the green dress, with her dark hair slightly undone and her cheek pressed against the sacred fur of his most private possession, and something crossed his face that was not quite rage and not quite recognition, something rawer than both, something that made his massive hands curl slowly at his sides. He said nothing else. He didn't have to. Because Dorothy, foolish, invisible, boring Dorothy, who had never once done a single memorable thing in her entire palace life, looked up at the most dangerous man in the kingdom, with his scent still moving through her blood like a second heartbeat, and thought with perfect clarity, "I have made a terrible, terrible mistake." The Alpha King is now hunting a thief through every corridor of his palace. He doesn't know yet that he's not hunting a criminal. He's hunting the one person the bond inside him has been starving for. Hit subscribe and follow this story before the next chapter drops, and drop a comment below telling me where in the world you're watching from. I want to find out just how far Dorothy's scent has traveled. I'll be saying hello to every single one of you. She ran. Not gracefully, not quietly. Dorothy Ogden ran the way a person runs when every intelligent thought in their head has been replaced by a single screaming instinct: move, move, move. her green skirts bunched in both fists, her soft-soled shoes barely whispering against the cold stone floor as she fled the armory through the servants' passage behind the eastern wall. She did not look back. She could hear him, not footsteps. He hadn't moved yet, she didn't think, or perhaps a man that size simply didn't need to move quickly to cover ground, but she could hear the quality of the silence he occupied, and it was the kind of silence that had weight to it. Pressure. The kind that follows you down corridors and under doors and into the marrow of your bones. She turned left, then right, then left again through a passage so narrow her shoulders brushed both walls, down a servant's staircase that smelled of tallow candles and old linen, and did not stop until she reached the lower laundry corridor and collapsed against the stone with both hands pressed flat to the wall behind her, chest heaving, vision slightly blurred. She stood there for a long moment. Then she reached up to press her fingers against the small mole at the corner of her mouth, a habit she had when she was frightened, or overwhelmed, or both, and took stock. She was alive. She was uncaught. She was in one piece. She also smelled, faintly but unmistakably, of pine resin and iron and something dark and ancient that had no business being in her lungs and which her traitorous nose was already cataloging with something she absolutely refused to call longing. Dorothy closed her eyes, breathed through her mouth, focused. The cloak was still in the armory. She had not taken it. She had not stolen anything. She had simply breathed. Surely that was not a crime. Surely there was no law in the kingdom specifically against a maid pressing her face into a king's sacred fur and inhaling deeply enough to imprint his entire scent signature onto the soft tissue of her memory. Surely. She pushed off the wall and straightened her apron with both hands, smoothing the white linen with the precise, deliberate movements of a woman who was absolutely not panicking. She was fine. She would return to the servants' quarters, she would say nothing to anyone, she would be, as she had always been, completely and thoroughly invisible. It was not until she was 3 corridors away, climbing the back stairs toward the east dormitory, that she felt it, the slight looseness at the back of her head. Her hand flew up, found the base of her braid, found the place where the green silk ribbon that held it together had been, and was no longer. She stopped walking. Her ribbon, which she had tied herself that morning, which had her initials embroidered into one end in small white thread because the senior maids insisted all personal items be marked D.O., 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 was sitting on the floor of the king's armory. Dorothy stood very still on the back stairs for a long time. Then she went to bed, because there was nothing else to do, and lay on her narrow cot with her eyes wide open and the smell of a king's fury still ghost quiet in the back of her throat. Russell Curry did not sleep. This was not unusual. He had not slept easily since the suppression, since the healers had buried the bond instinct so deep inside him that most days he could almost convince himself it wasn't there. Sleep was a negotiation. His wolf side accepted it in 2-hour intervals, grudgingly, the way a prisoner accepts water. But that night after the armory, sleep was not a negotiation. Sleep had left the building entirely. He sat on the edge of his bed in the pre-dawn dark, elbows on his knees, enormous hands loosely linked, staring at nothing. The door to his chamber was closed. His personal guard stood outside it. Somewhere in the lower palace, he could hear the night watch changing rotation. He was not thinking about any of that. He was thinking about a scent. It had no right to still be there. He had left the armory, he had bathed, he had stood for 20 minutes in steam hot enough to strip paint from iron, and it was still there. In the back of his sinuses, in the soft animal part of his brain that never fully shut off, a scent like warm skin and something faintly floral, and underneath both of those, something sweeter and more complicated that his wolf recognized with an enthusiasm that was frankly inappropriate. Sweetness, and underneath that, he ground his jaw and said the word only inside his own skull where no one could hear it. Arousal. Not his, hers. Whoever she was, kneeling in his armory with her eyes closed and her face buried in his cloak, she had been... He cut the thought off cleanly and stood up. He crossed to the window, looked out at the pre-dawn gray of the palace grounds, breathed through his nose once, deliberately, which was a mistake, because the ghost of her was still there, and his wolf stirred like something enormous and patient awaking from a long sleep. He turned from the window. "Aldrich," he said, not loudly. His guard opened the chamber door within 2 seconds. They always did. "Your Majesty, I want every maid in the palace assembled in the eastern corridor by the time the morning bell rings." He did not look at Aldrich. He was pulling on his coat, methodical, unhurried, like he did everything. "Every maid, no exceptions. No one leaves their dormitory until I say." Aldrich was quiet for precisely 1 beat. "Shall I tell them the reason, Your Majesty?" Russell's hands paused on his buttons. "No," he said. He didn't need to explain himself. He was the Alpha King. He had found a green silk ribbon on the floor of his armory, D.O. embroidered in white thread, small and neat and damning. And somewhere in this palace there was a woman whose scent was currently dismantling 3 years of careful suppression. That was all anyone needed to know. Or rather, it was all he needed to know, which amounted to the same thing. He picked up the ribbon from the side table where he had placed it, turned it once between his fingers, set it in his breast pocket. Then he went to find her. Dorothy found out about the assembly the way she found out about most things, from Marta, the round-faced laundry girl 2 cots over, who shook her awake in the gray pre-dawn with wide eyes and urgent hands, and the whispered intelligence that the Alpha King himself had ordered every maid in the palace to the eastern corridor now, immediately, no questions. Dorothy sat up. She had not slept. "Do you know why?" she asked, keeping her voice very level. Marta shook her head. "Aldrich came himself. You know what that means. It's serious. Someone's done something." She was already pulling on her apron, fingers fumbling with the ties. Dorothy was not listening to the rest. She was already dressed. She was already calculating. 40 maids in the eastern corridor. Russell Curry walking the line. She had been close to him for perhaps 30 seconds in the armory. 30 seconds in which she had been kneeling with her face in his cloak, which was arguably not her best tactical position. But 30 seconds was enough. She knew what she had done to the cloak. She had left her scent on it the way he had left his in her memory, and if the stories about alpha senses were even half true, he would find her in a line of 40 women like a man finds a candle in a dark room. She needed to not be in that corridor. The problem was that not being in that corridor was its own kind of confession. Absence would be noticed. Marta would notice. The senior maids would notice. And absence in the palace of an Alpha King conducting an official assembly was 1 step below the dungeon and 2 steps below whatever he had planned for the woman who had breathed his sacred fur. Dorothy tied her apron strings with numb fingers and followed Marta down the hall. She stood at the far end of the line. She kept her eyes on the floor. She breathed through her mouth. He walked the corridor in silence. She heard him before she saw him, not his footsteps. He hadn't moved yet, she didn't think. Or perhaps a man that size simply didn't need to move quickly to cover ground. But she could hear the quality of the silence he occupied, and it was the kind of silence that had weight to it. Pressure, the kind that follows you down corridors and under doors and into the marrow of your bones. He walked correctly forward. He stopped at the other end of the line and then turned back. Her heartbeat thudded behind her ribs. Then he turned his back on the assembled maids, said nothing to anyone in the room, and walked out of the corridor with the same silent, complete authority with which he had entered. Dorothy had no idea how. She was not going to question it. She was simply going to survive this morning, return to her duties, and never go near the East Wing again for as long as she lived. It was not until she was 3 corridors away, climbing the back stairs toward the East dormitory, that she felt it, the slight looseness at the back of her head. Her hand flew up, found the base of her braid, found the place where the green silk ribbon that held it together had been, and was no longer. She stopped walking. Her ribbon. Her ribbon, which she had tied herself that morning, which had her initials embroidered into one end in small white thread, because the senior maids insisted all personal items be marked D.O., 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 was sitting on the floor of the king's armory. Dorothy stood very still on the back stairs for a long time. Then she went to bed, because there was nothing else to do, and lay on her narrow cot with her eyes wide open and the smell of a king's fury still ghost quiet in the back of her throat. Dorothy found out about the assembly the way she found out about most things. The schedule change came 2 days later, posted on the servants' board in the handwriting of the head housekeeper. D.O.W. reassigned, King's private chambers, morning rotation. Dorothy read it 3 times. Then she read it again, in case the words rearranged themselves into something less catastrophic on the 4th pass. They did not. She considered, briefly, going to the head housekeeper and explaining that she had a conflict, a prior commitment, a sudden and debilitating illness, but the head housekeeper was a woman who had survived 4 different monarchs and had the emotional flexibility of load-bearing stone, and Dorothy had exactly no reason to give for refusing a routine assignment that would not immediately result in worse questions than the ones she was trying to avoid. So, she went. The king's chambers were empty. Of course they were. It was mid-morning, he would be in council, he had a kingdom to run. She had 2 hours at minimum. She worked efficiently and silently, the way she always did. Her nose filtering the room's information the way other people read text. The cold hearth, the boot leather, the ink on the writing desk, the faint mineral sharpness of authority that lived in the walls themselves. She did not touch anything she was not supposed to touch. She did not linger near the wardrobe. She kept her eyes on the task and her hands moving and her mind carefully, deliberately blank. She was on her knees relaying the hearthrug when she heard the outer door. Dorothy went absolutely still. Footsteps, one set, heavy and even, and completely without the tentative quality that belonging to a servant. The outer chamber, then closer, then the inner door, which opened without a knock because the man on the other side of it knocked for no one. She was facing the fireplace. She heard him stop. The silence lasted exactly long enough for her to understand that it was not the silence of a man who had not noticed her. It was the silence of a man who had noticed her immediately and was now doing something with that information. "You're new to this rotation," he said. His voice was the same as it had been in the armory, low, even, not a question precisely, but with the shape of one. Dorothy sat back on her heels and turned, keeping her gaze respectfully lowered, her face arranged in the pleasant blankness she had spent years perfecting. "Yes, Your Majesty. The schedule was updated 2 days ago. I can return later if—" "Stay." One word, the same weight as a door closing. She stayed. She kept her hands busy with the hearthrug and her eyes on the floor, and her breathing through her mouth, shallow and careful. He moved to the writing desk. She heard the sound of papers, the scratch of a pen, the ordinary architecture of a man at work in his own space, which should have made the room feel normal, and did not. She could feel him the way you feel a storm system, not with your skin, but with something older than skin. Her gift was translating him in real time, the tight, controlled anger of the council meeting still burning at the edges of his scent, the deep fatigue underneath it, and something else. Something restless and searching and not quite satisfied, circling like a wolf in a small room. She was almost done. Another few minutes. She would finish the hearth, collect her materials, and be gone before whatever was building in the air between them found a shape. She was reaching for the ashpan when he said, without looking up from his papers, "What is your name?" Dorothy's hand closed around the ashpan handle. "Dorothy, Your Majesty. Dorothy Ogden." The pen stopped scratching. The silence was enormous. "Ogden," he repeated, just the word, tasting it, and she heard something shift in his voice. Not recognition, not quite, but the edge of something, the way a hunting dog's head comes up when the wind changes. "Yes, Your Majesty." She stood, collected her things, kept her hands steady. "Shall I come back to finish the—" "You're dismissed," he said, back to the papers. Voice closed again, like a shutter. Dorothy walked to the door at a perfectly normal pace. She did not run until she was in the servants' corridor with the door shut behind her. The corridor interrogation had not worked. Russell stood in the eastern hallway and understood this, and understood it with the particular cold frustration of a man who does not fail at things, and yet was currently, undeniably, failing. He had walked 40 women. He had been thorough. His instincts were not failing him. They had been sharpened to a point by 3 days of a scent that would not leave his head. And yet, when he reached the end of that line, he had nothing definitive, nothing he could name. He had felt something at the end of the row, a pull, brief and snapping, like a cord drawn tight, in the space near the last cluster of women, but she had kept her face down, and his suppressed bond was behaving like a compass near a magnet, frantic, unreliable, spinning. He was going to need a different approach. He took to standing in doorways, not conspicuously, not with any ceremony, but the Alpha King began appearing in corridors at odd hours, leaning against a pillar in the lower hall, or standing at the top of the servants' stair with his arms crossed and his expression set to its factory default of mild, ambient menace. Maids rerouted. Footmen found urgent business elsewhere. The palace gave him a wide, nervous berth. He was not looking for just anyone. He knew that now. He was looking for a specific quality of scent, faint and layered, that kept surfacing in his memory at the worst possible moments, during council briefings, during weapons training, in the hour before dawn when the suppression was at its thinnest and his wolf paced and pressed and wanted. He found the ribbon again one evening, sitting in his breast pocket where he had placed it, and turned it between his fingers with the focused patience of a man disassembling a lock. D.O. He would find her. The coronation ceremony of the Southern Lords was not Dorothy's assignment. She was very clear on this point. She was assigned to the lower kitchens for the duration of the event. She had checked the board 3 times. She had confirmed with Marta. She was, by every administrative measure, nowhere near the throne room on the afternoon the Southern Lords processed through the palace to renew their oaths of fealty. What she was not supposed to be doing was carrying a second tray of ceremonial goblets through the upper service corridor at the exact moment that the lower kitchen boy slipped on a wet stone, dropped his own tray, and grabbed Dorothy's arm for balance. The goblets went one way, Dorothy went another, specifically through the service door at the exact moment it was pushed open from the other side, sending her stumbling forward onto the threshold of the throne room itself, in full view of 40 Southern Lords, 6 senior advisors, and 1 Alpha King sitting on a raised dais at the end of the hall. The room went very quiet. Dorothy was on her knees. She was spending a remarkable amount of this story on her knees, she noted distantly, one hand flat on the marble floor, the other wrapped around a ceremonial goblet she had somehow retained, her dark hair half loose from a braid, her apron crooked, and her face, she was fairly certain, the precise color of the formal red banners flanking the throne. She did not look up. She was absolutely, completely, categorically not going to look up. She looked up. He was already looking at her. Russell Curry sat on the throne of the kingdom with the stillness of something carved rather than alive, broad shoulders straight, dark eyes level, one hand resting on the carved arm of the throne with the relaxed authority of a man who has never once in his life needed to prove that he belonged somewhere. He wore dark ceremonial armor, the fur-lined pauldrons broad enough to block the light from the high windows behind him. His expression was exactly what it always was, controlled, cold, and vaguely murderous. But his eyes had gone gold, not the flat formal dark of a king conducting ceremony, gold, burning, wolf bright, locked onto Dorothy with the intensity of something that had been looking for her for days and had just, very suddenly, found her. Around him, the Southern Lords were beginning to murmur. Aldrich was moving. Someone was hissing at Dorothy from the direction of the service door. The entire ceremonial apparatus of the kingdom's most formal political event was threatening to come slightly apart at the seams, and Dorothy was the seam. She should stand up. She should apologize. She should back through the door and disappear and let the event reassemble itself around her absence. She was reaching for the floor to push herself upright when his voice came across the room, cutting cleanly through every other sound. Bring her forward. Dorothy's hand went flat on the marble again. A guard materialized at her elbow. She was assisted, not unkindly, but without any particular concern for her preference in the matter, to her feet, and then walked, one slow step at a time, across the full length of the throne room, past 40 Southern Lords who watched with the avid sideways attention of men who knew they were witnessing something they would describe in detail later. She stopped at the foot of the dais. She stared at the middle button of his ceremonial chest piece. She was close enough to smell him now. She couldn't help it. Proximity was proximity. Her nose didn't consult her feelings on the matter, and the full force of his scent hit her at close range like a physical thing. Iron and pine and that ancient storm-dark undertone that had been living in her memory for days and was now, here, in person, substantially more overwhelming than the memory. He stood. He was so much larger upright. She had understood this in the armory, with several feet of cold air between them. She understood it differently now, with only the height of the dais step, because he was a mountain of a man in the way that mountains are nonchalant about their own scale. He simply was, and everything around him adjusted accordingly. He descended the step. He was looking at her with the focused precision of a wolf who has been tracking something for days and is now, at very close range, making absolutely certain. He reached out. His hand, wide-palmed, scarred along the knuckles, enormous in the way all of him was enormous, closed gently around her wrist to steady her, because she had swayed slightly without meaning to, and the contact was catastrophic. Dorothy had scented him at a distance. She had breathed him from his cloak. She had parsed the edges of him from across a chamber. None of that had prepared her for skin, for the direct current of his warmth against her pulse point, for the way her gift lit up like every window in a dark house suddenly blazing with light, reading him in real time and at full volume. The shock of recognition, the restless, hungry, searching thing in him suddenly going completely, perfectly still, like a compass needle that has finally found north. She felt him feel it. She watched something move through his face, controlled, swiftly managed, but there for one unguarded moment before the king's expression closed over it like water over a stone. His grip on her wrist did not tighten. He did not move. He simply held on, as if letting go required a decision he hadn't made yet. Behind them, the room had gone so quiet that Dorothy could hear the candles in the high chandeliers. "You dropped something," Russell said, very quietly. Not to the room, to her. His voice was not loud. It was precise and low, and carried the register of a man working very hard at something that looked like stillness. He reached into his breast pocket with his free hand. He held up a green silk ribbon, embroidered at one end in small white thread. D.O. Dorothy stared at it. "Dorothy Ogden," he said. Not a question. Never a question. Just her name, in his mouth, which did something to her chest that she did not have technical language for. His gold-tinged eyes stayed on her face. "You were in my armory." The throne room held its breath. Dorothy thought about lying. She thought about it very seriously, with genuine commitment, for approximately 2 full seconds. And then she looked up, for the first time, all the way up, into the burning gold of his gaze, and understood with perfect clarity that whatever was happening in this man's body had nothing to do with anger about a crime. His jaw was set, his expression was controlled, but his eyes were starving. "Yes," she said, very quietly. "Your Majesty, I was." Something moved through him. She felt it in the hand around her wrist, not tightening, just present. Suddenly more present, as if every molecule of him had oriented in one direction. The southern lords behind her were definitely going to have a lot to say about this later. Russell Curry, Alpha King, let out a single slow breath through his nose, looked at the ribbon in his fingers, looked at her, made some internal calculation that she could feel but not quite read. Then he released her wrist, stepped back, and returned the ribbon to his pocket. "Resume the ceremony," he said to the room, in a tone that brooked nothing whatsoever. He walked back up the dais, sat, and resumed the precise carved stillness of a king conducting formal business. Dorothy was escorted, somewhat briskly, back through the service door on the other side of it. Back against the wall, wrist pressed against her sternum, feeling the ghost of his grip like a brand. He knew her name now. He had known her name, she realized, since the chamber. He had filed it. He had waited. He had let it sit in his breast pocket next to her ribbon until the right moment, and then he had used it in front of 40 southern lords like a thing he had already decided. Dorothy pressed her fingers at the mole at the corner of her mouth and stared at the servants' corridor ceiling. She understood now with complete clarity, in an extraordinary amount of trouble. Not the dungeon kind, not the treason kind, though that was still technically on the table, and she had not forgotten it for a single moment. The other kind, the kind with no clean exit and no legal precedent, and no chapter in any palace handbook she had ever read. the kind where an alpha king's eyes go gold in a throne room full of witnesses, and the air between two people changed quality entirely, and afterward, the ordinary stone walls of a servant's corridor seemed somehow insufficient to contain whatever had just been set in motion. She was in trouble. And from the weight of his gaze still sitting somewhere behind her sternum, she was increasingly, helplessly certain. So was he. Comment below and tell me where in the world you're reading from. I want to know exactly how far Dorothy's scent has traveled. Subscribe so you don't miss what happens when the Alpha King stops waiting and starts hunting in earnest. I see every single comment, and I will be saying hello to you by name. The summons came in the form of a folded note slipped under Dorothy's dormitory before dawn, written in handwriting so elegant it was practically its own kind of authority. Come to the East Solar before the morning bell. Come alone. Tell no one. No signature. None was needed. There was only one woman in the palace who wrote like that, like every letter had been trained since birth to behave itself. Lady Seraphine Voss was everything Dorothy was not, and she wore it with the way she wore everything else, effortlessly and with excellent posture. She was standing at the Solar's tall window when Dorothy arrived, her pale gold hair dressed in an elaborate knot, her morning gown the precise blue of winter sky. She was beautiful in the architectural way of women who have been told so since childhood and have organized their entire self-concept around the fact. She was also, by all official accounts, the woman the Alpha King was contracted to marry before the winter solstice. She turned when Dorothy entered, looked her over once with eyes the color of still water, and said without preamble, "He's going to find you." Dorothy said nothing. Don't bother denying it. Seraphine moved to the dressing table, where a small glass bottle sat apart from the others, dark amber, sealed with wax. I've watched him for 2 years. I know what he looks like when the bond instinct is active. He looked at you in the throne room like a man who has stopped pretending he isn't looking. She picked up the bottle. This is oil of white cedar and iron salt. My family's perfumer made it specifically to suppress scent signatures. We use it when negotiating with wolf-blooded dignitaries who use scent as a read on sincerity. Something moved across her face that was not quite the expression of a woman protecting her romantic claim. It was more complicated than that, softer in a way that had nothing to do with Dorothy. You are potentially that reason, but only if you survive long enough to matter. Dorothy picked up the bottle. It smelled of cedar and cold metal and something antiseptic underneath. Nothing like herself, nothing warm, nothing that her gift would produce. It would work. Dorothy understood scent well enough to know it would work. She also understood, in the way she understood most things, quietly, completely, without the ability to unknow them, that wearing it would feel like disappearing. Like covering the one real thing about her with something manufactured and false. She wore it anyway. It worked for 4 days. She moved through the palace inside the cedar and iron shell of Seraphine's perfumer and felt Russell Curry's attention slide past her twice in corridors and once in the Great Hall, without catching. She watched him from the corner of her eye each time, the brief fractional pause, the almost recognition, the faint tightening of his jaw when the scent trail he was following went cold again. And told herself that this was survival, that invisibility was what she was good at, that this was simply returning to the life she had always had, which was fine, which was sufficient, which was everything she needed. She was not convincing herself. On the 5th day, he walked into the East Garden. Dorothy was there because the head housekeeper had sent her to collect herbs from the kitchen beds, rosemary, thyme, the lavender that grew along the south wall. And she was on her knees in the soil doing exactly that, with her basket and her small knife and the cedar iron perfume sitting on her skin like a closed door, when she heard the garden gate open behind her.
She did not need to turn around to know. She felt him the way she always felt him, the pressure change, the air reorganizing itself, her gift lifting its head like an animal that has caught something on the wind. She kept her hands in the lavender and her eyes on the soil and breathed carefully through her mouth. His footsteps on the garden path were unhurried. He was not walking toward her specifically. He had probably come for the same reason people in power sometimes walked in gardens. Not for the gardens, but for the brief fiction of open air and the illusion that the walls of responsibility had stepped back slightly. She heard him stop. Not near her, 20 feet away perhaps, near the stone bench at the garden's center, where the rose bushes grew in a formal arch. She heard him sit. She heard the quiet, barely audible exhale of a man who was more tired than he will tell anyone. She kept working. She was reaching for the rosemary, further along the bed, slightly closer to the bench, when the wind shifted. It was a small thing, an adjustment in the morning air, carrying the warmth of the kitchen walls and the moisture from the herb beds and whatever Dorothy was underneath cedar and iron. And it moved, this small, treacherous wind, directly from her kneeling body toward the stone bench at the garden center. She heard him go still. Not the controlled stillness he maintained as a performance of authority, the other stillness, the one she had felt in the throne room when her wrist was in his hand, the compass needle stillness of something that has stopped searching because it is found. Take off the perfume. His voice was quiet, even. It came across the garden without effort, the way all of his voice did, using no more force than necessary and requiring no more force than it used. Dorothy's hand closed around the rosemary sprig, but held on. "Your Majesty." "It's cedar oil." He said it without accusation, factual. Cedar oil, iron salt base. It suppresses the natural signature. A pause. "It's very good. It would work on anyone with a normal instinct." Another pause, shorter. "Take it off." Dorothy sat back on her heels, looked at her hands, the soil under her nails, the lavender bruised against her palm releasing its own clean scent into the air. She could run. She had run before. She was, at this point, something of an expert in the mechanics of running from this man, and she had so far achieved a survival rate of 100%, which was, by any measure, a good record. She turned around. He was no longer on the bench. He had crossed half the garden in the time it took her to make that decision, and he stood 10 feet away with his arms at his sides, and his expression doing the thing it did when he was managing something that wanted very badly to be unmanaged, held together by the visible effort of a man whose control was both his greatest strength and the thing that was currently costing him the most. His eyes were gold. They had been, she suspected, from the moment the wind shifted. "Dorothy Ogden," he said. Quiet, just her name, the same way he had said it in the throne room, like a thing he had been carrying. "Your Majesty." She rose to her feet, lifted her chin. Her heart was doing something loud and unreasonable in her chest, and she ignored it with the focused discipline of a woman who had been ignoring unreasonable things about herself for days. "I know what you think you're—" "I think," he said carefully, "that you were in my armory. I think you found the cloak. I think what happened after that was not—" He stopped, jaw tight, choosing words with the precision of a man defusing something. "It was not your intention." "No, it wasn't. And I think," he continued, and his voice had dropped to something that was barely above quiet, the kind of register that her gift translated not as anger, but as a man holding very still at the edge of something enormous, "that you have been wearing someone else's scent for 4 days to prevent me from finding you." Dorothy said nothing. "I found you," he said. "I noticed," she said. Something moved in his face that was not quite the expression she expected from the Alpha King. It was less certain than that, raw at the edges in a way that his public face never was. He took one step toward her and stopped, as if the 10 feet between them was a negotiation he was conducting with himself. "I'm not hunting a criminal," he said, low, direct, the words costing him something. "What happened in the armory, the tracking, the search, it isn't anger. It isn't—" He stopped. His hands at his sides had closed briefly into fists and opened again. "There is a bond, suppressed. My healers suppressed it 3 years ago for political reasons that I will not detail here. Your scent, what you did with the cloak, it activated something that I have not been able to deactivate since." The garden was very quiet. Dorothy looked at him,
at the gold of his eyes and the controlled line of his shoulders and the 10 feet of carefully maintained distance that she understood now was not coldness, but restraint, was him at enormous personal cost not closing the gap without her permission. She thought about Seraphine, who was in love with a guard she couldn't have. She thought about the word treason, which had not left her vocabulary since the armory. She thought about what it meant to be Dorothy Ogden, small, low-status, invisible Dorothy Ogden, standing in a garden with soil under her nails and a king's bond instinct pointed at her like a compass that had finally found north. She made a decision. She made it the way she made most decisions, quietly, completely, and with the knowledge that she would not be able to unmake it. "Your Majesty," she said. Her voice was steady. She was proud of it for being steady. "I think you should know," she stopped, breathed. I can't." She looked at him directly, because she owed him that, at least. "I don't feel what you feel, and I think you should redirect the betrothal as originally planned, and I think we should both—" Stop. His voice was still quiet, but something in it had changed. Not anger, not the murderous cold she had expected. Something worse than that. Something that her gift translated with a clarity she didn't ask for, as a sound a man makes when something that was almost within reach becomes definitively not. "I understand," he said, formal, closed, king voice back on like a coat. He nodded once, very correctly, the way he would nod to a political advisor. "Thank you for your honesty." He turned and walked back through the garden gate. Dorothy stood in the herb beds with her lavender and her rosemary and the lie she had just told sitting in her chest like a stone, and told herself she had done the right thing. She told herself a great many things. She knew something was wrong before anyone told her. She felt it the way she felt most things, through the air, through the change in the palace's scent weather, through the way the corridors smelled different by nightfall. The guards sharper, more adrenaline bright. The head housekeeper's hands smelling of the lavender oil she used only when anxious. Something electric and wrong moving through the building like weather before lightning. Marta found her in the lower hall just before the dinner bell, white-faced and wringing her apron. "The king," Martha said. "He's gone. Into the North Woods, alone, on foot. The guards tried to follow and he gave them the alpha command to stand down and they couldn't." She pressed her hands together. "Aldrich is beside himself. They're saying he's—" She lowered her voice. "They're saying he's shifted, gone feral. It hasn't happened since before the suppression, and they don't know if he'll—" Dorothy was already moving. She didn't think about it. She did not consult the reasonable, self-preserving part of her mind that had served her adequately for her entire palace life. She went to her dormitory, changed her soft-soled shoes for the heavier pair, and walked out the servants' door into the north-facing dark. She washed the cedar oil off her wrists in the horse trough at the stable yard, scrubbing until her own scent rose clean and unobstructed because she understood, with the bone-deep certainty of her gift, that this was not a situation for masks. The North Woods began at the edge of the palace grounds where the formal gardens gave out to old growth. Dark trees, dense and ancient, the undergrowth thick with the kind of wild, dark smell that belonged to nothing civilized. She stood at the tree line and breathed. She found him in the air immediately. Not the controlled iron and pine signature of the king in his corridors. Something rawer, older. The wolf underneath the man, running without the architecture of civilization to organize it, and underneath that, like a wound, the specific anguished frequency she had heard in the garden when she said, "I don't feel what you feel," now amplified to something that made her chest hurt from 20 yards out. She walked into the trees. She was not afraid of the dark. She had a better navigation system than eyes. She followed him by scent the way he had followed her by scent through the palace, turning where the trail turned, pausing where it doubled back, moving through the undergrowth with her hands out and the cold air of the forest feeding her information in a steady, clear stream. She heard him before she saw him, not growling, something quieter than that,
a sound that had no human word for it, low and rhythmic and exhausted, coming from a clearing ahead where the trees opened onto a space of gray moonlit grass. Dorothy stopped at the clearing's edge. He was massive. She had understood intellectually what a shifted alpha wolf would look like. She had not understood it in the way she understood it now. The sheer scale of him, the dark fur that was the exact color of his cloak, the breadth of him against the pale grass, his sides moving with the heavy, labored breathing of a creature that has run itself to the edge of its own endurance. He was not pacing. He was low to the ground, head dropped, the enormous line of his spine curved inward with something that her gift translated without hesitation or metaphor: grief. Dorothy breathed him in. She read him the way she read everything, completely, without the ability to stop. And what she found was not the feral violence she had been braced for. What she found was a creature that had rejected the kill drive and turned it inward. Not a predator in a rage, a predator that had been told the thing it had been seeking did not exist and had run until the running was the only thing left. She had done this. The stone that had been sitting in her chest since the garden cracked cleanly in two. She stepped into the clearing. His head came up immediately, gold eyes in the dark fixed on her with the total, unblinking attention of something that operated on instinct and nothing else. A sound moved through his chest, not a growl exactly, not a warning. She processed it as pure recognition, the same frequency as the compass needle, a different octave. She walked toward him. She heard him shift, not the full shift back, just the adjustment of a large body in uncertain territory, weight redistributing, haunches dropping slightly, the posture of a wolf that is not attacking but is not calm either, that is somewhere between those two states in a country that has no map. She stopped 6 feet away. He was watching her with the gold-burning, fully present attention of something that has stripped every social mechanism it was built with and is operating entirely on the oldest signals available. She could feel the bond instinct from here, no longer suppressed, no longer leashed by healers or duty or the careful architecture of a king's self-control, just present, enormous, and simple, pointed at her like the one true direction. She knew what she needed to do. She had read about it, in the old texts she wasn't supposed to have access to, in the lower library, in the sections on wolf-blooded bonding before the modern suppressions made the information largely academic. She had read about it the way she read about most things she needed to survive, quietly, completely, and with the understanding that knowledge has no value unless you are willing to use it when it costs you something. Dorothy tilted her head. Not fully, not yet. Slowly, with complete deliberateness, she turned her face to the left and lifted her chin, exposing the full line of her throat to the moonlight and the gold-burning eyes of the feral wolf in front of her, the oldest signal, older than language, older than kingdoms, the one that said, "I know what you are, and I am not afraid of it, and I am choosing, right now, with full knowledge of what that means, to be here." The clearing went completely still. She felt the moment it landed, the moment his gift received her and translated it correctly, felt it move through him like a current, felt the frantic circling energy of the feral state hit the stillness of recognition and simply stop. He crossed the 6 feet between them before she registered that he was moving. He was not in wolf form when he reached her. She wasn't entirely sure when the shift had happened, somewhere in those 6 feet, in the space between feral grief and her bared throat. But the hands that came up, one on either side of her face, tilting her chin further, pressing his nose and mouth to the line of her exposed neck, were human hands, large and scarred and trembling slightly in a way she suspected he would not have permitted if he had any of his careful architectural self-control available to him. He breathed her in. Not a small breath, not the careful, controlled inhale of a man who was managing the situation, a deep, shuddering breath. Her, Dorothy, cedar oil gone, mask gone, nothing between her scent and his instinct except 6 feet of dark forest air, and she felt him come back.
Not all at once, in increments, like a building reassembling itself after the storm has passed.
First, the trembling in his hands easing, then his breathing steadying, then the enormous tension in his frame releasing by degrees, until what was pressed against her with his mouth at her throat was no longer a feral wolf, and not yet the full formal architecture of the Alpha King, but the exhausted, exposed, ungoverned man somewhere between them. He said nothing for a long time. Neither did she. The forest was quiet around them, cold and dark and smelling of old trees and the specific alchemical mixture of two people who had been circling each other for days and had run out of distance. When he finally lifted his head, his eyes were dark again. Not the wolf gold, not the controlled public darkness. Something in between, raw and tired, and for the first time since she had known him, entirely without the performance of authority. He looked at her for a long moment. "There is no one else," he said. Not an accusation, a statement of fact delivered by a man who could read the truth of it in the air. Dorothy met his gaze. "No," she said quietly, "there isn't. You were afraid." "I'm still afraid," she said. "Your Majesty." "Russell," he said, low, deliberate, the word offered the way a man opens a door and then waits, not pushing, to see if you choose to walk through. She looked at him, this man who had splintered a door with one hand and stood in corridors like a force of weather and sat on a throne in gold-burning silence and run himself to the edge of the world when she told him a lie in a garden. "I'm a maid," she said. "I have no title, no standing. In the morning the council will—" "I know what I am," he said, quietly. "I know what you are. I also know—" He paused, choosing, and she could feel him choosing, feel the precision of it. "That my family has been looking for a seer for 3 generations. His eyes found hers directly. "Your gift, Dorothy. The scenting. It isn't a quirk. You know what it is." The forest held its breath. She did know. She had known, she realized, for longer than she had admitted to herself, had known it in the way she knew things she was not ready for, which was completely and quietly at the back of her mind where she kept the information until she was strong enough to look at it. "I descended from the seer line," she said, very quietly. "Yes. That's why the bond activated." "That's part of it," he said. And his voice had done something it had not done in any corridor or throne room or garden. It had gone gentle, not soft precisely, gentle, which was different, which meant restrained power rather than absence of it. "The bond doesn't activate for bloodline alone. You know that." She did know that. She looked up at him, this man who was a mountain, who always looked murderous and was currently looking at her with the undefended expression of someone who has been very tired for a long time and has somewhat unexpectedly found a place to put it down. She said, "The council will object." "Yes." "Seraphine's family will be—" "Seraphine," he said, with the precision of a man who has done his research, "has a palace guard she has been in love with for 2 years. I have already spoken with her father's representative. The betrothal will be dissolved by the new moon." Something that was almost, barely, the architecture of a smile moved at the corner of his mouth. She seemed relieved. Dorothy stared at him. "You knew," she said. "I'm not actually as oblivious as my expression suggests," he said. And there it was, fractional, controlled, but real, the ghost of something that in another man would have been a smile. On Russell Curry, it was enormous. "I simply appear that way." Dorothy looked at him for a long time, at the dark forest around them, and the moonlit clearing, and the ground they were standing on, which was cold and real, and did not care at all about bloodlines or palace titles, or the careful social architecture that had kept her invisible and kneeling, and perfectly safely unnoticed for her entire life. She reached up. She pressed her palm flat against his chest, over the armor, over the leather, over the place where the heartbeat of a very large, very controlled, very tired man was doing something that was not controlled at all. "Russell," she said, his name, plain in the dark forest, no title. His hand came up and covered hers, both of them still, both of them breathing. "Dorothy Ogden," he said, very quietly, "you have been an extraordinary amount of trouble." "I know," she said. "I am," he said, completely unbothered by this. She laughed. It came out small and slightly undone and entirely real, and she felt him receive it the way her gift received his scent, completely without armor. His thumb moved across the back of her hand once. The bond between them settled, not the frantic hunting urgency of the past days, not the compass needle desperate north of a suppressed instinct finally activated, something quieter, the difference between a storm and weather, the difference between searching and finding. Above the north woods, the moon moved behind a cloud and came out again on the other side, calm and indifferent and very, very old. The cold air smelled of pine and soil and lavender faintly, still on her hands from the garden. And underneath all of it, layered and permanent now, the specific alchemical signature of two people who have stopped pretending they are standing exactly where they are. Dorothy kept her hand where it was. Russell kept his hand over hers. The palace behind them could wait. That's the full story, but only if you were here for it. Subscribe so you never miss another chapter, and drop a comment below telling me exactly where in the world you're watching from. I will find every single comment. I will say hello to you by name, because Dorothy and Russell's story traveled this far, and I want to know just how far that is.